Imagine you're a German ace. You're sitting in the cockpit of a Messerschmitt Bf 109, a veritable shark of the skies, small, fast, and deadly. It's the fall of 1943. Radar picks up an enemy plane. You pull up and see it. It's not an elegant Spitfire. It's not a sleek Mustang. The thing flying in front of you looks like a flying bathtub. It's ridiculously big. Its fuselage is thick. Its wings are short compared to its body. It looks so heavy you wonder how physics will let it leave the ground. You smirk. On the radio, the German pilots call it der fliegende Ziegelstein, the flying brick. You do what every German pilot has been trained to do. You dive down, aim, and pull the trigger. SFX. The 20mm cannon goes off. Boom, boom, boom. The 20mm rounds rip through the metal. You can clearly see the aluminum fragments flying from the wings and fuselage. Smoke billows. In all your combat experience, the target should explode, or at least break off its wings and go into a free-fall spiral. But it doesn't. The bathtub only shakes slightly. It keeps flying. The engines still roar steadily. And worse, it starts to circle. Your smile fades. Because when the giant thing turns around, you see that the front of its wings are covered in gun barrels. Not 2, not 4, but 8 12.7 caliber heavy machine guns. In that moment, you realize you've made a fatal mistake. You didn't shoot at an airplane. You just pissed off a flying tank. Welcome to the story of the P-47 Thunderbolt, the ugly, stubborn, and immortal of the U.S. Air Force. To understand why the Americans created such a monster, we have to go back to 1940. Europe is burning. Britain is struggling to fend off Luftwaffe air raids. Across the ocean, the USAAF is panicking. Why? Because they realized a painful truth. All their best fighters at the time, like the P-40 Warhawk or the P-39 Airacobra, were rubbish compared to the Germans. The Germans flew higher, faster, and climbed better. If the Americans went to war with what they had, it would be a massacre. They needed something new. Something that could fly at 30,000 feet and go toe-to-toe with the German monsters. They turned to Alexander Kartveli, the chief engineer of Republic Aviation. Visual. Portrait of Alexander Kartveli, a stern-looking man standing over a technical drawing. Kartveli was a genius, but an eccentric genius. He looked at the military requirements and said, "You don't need a sports plane. You need a killing machine." While other engineers, like the designers of the Spitfire and the Zero, followed the philosophy of lighter is better, Kartveli thought differently. He believed that in a total war, firepower and durability were more important than grace. He didn't start with aerodynamic design. He started by choosing an engine. And he chose the biggest one he could find. This is the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. In 1940, this was the most powerful aircraft engine in the world. It had 18 cylinders, arranged in 2 rows of stars. Displacement was 46 liters. Its power, 2,000 horsepower. To give you an idea, the legendary Merlin engine in the early Spitfires only had about 1,000 horsepower. The P-47 Seconds engine was twice as powerful. It was the size of a small truck and weighed more than 1 ton. Putting this engine in a single-seat fighter at the time was a crazy idea. It was like trying to cram a Formula One engine into a bicycle. But Kartveli had a big problem. The more powerful the engine, the more air it needed. Especially at 30,000 feet, where the air was thin, the engine would suffocate and lose power. The only solution was to use a turbocharger. Visual, 3D graphics. Simulate the flow of air from the nose of the plane, down the belly, out the tail, and back to the engine. But the turbocharger for the R2800 engine was too large. It couldn't be mounted right behind the engine as usual because it would make the nose of the plane too big, blocking the pilot's view. Kartveli did something unprecedented. He put the turbocharger all the way to the tail of the plane. He designed a giant air duct system that ran along the belly of the plane. Cold air entered from the nose, ran along the tail to be compressed by the turbocharger, pressure, then run back to the nose to feed the engine. This piping system was so complex and cumbersome that Kartveli was forced to design the fuselage around it. The result was a bulging belly to accommodate the pipes. This gave the plane a round, chubby shape. The plane was not designed. It was built around the engine and the piping system. When the design was completed, military officials were shocked. Look at this comparison. A British Spitfire Mark V had a takeoff weight of about 3 tons. A P-47 Thunderbolt, fully loaded with weapons and fuel, weighed nearly 8 tons. It was more than twice the weight of the Allied aircraft. In fact, the P-47 weighed more than some light bombers of the time. When the first P-47 seconds arrived in England in late 1942 to join the 8th Air Force, RAF pilots couldn't help but laugh. They stood on the runway, watching the olive-green monsters trundle along, and asked the American pilots, "Hey buddy, is that a fighter or a troop bus? Where are the pilots hiding in this shed?" The British pilots nicknamed it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, but also the Milk Jug because of its round shape, which resembled the milk jugs delivered at home at the time. The ridicule went beyond words. In the first test flights, the 8-ton weight problem became apparent. The P-47 climbed too slowly. Visual: a Bf-109 climbs while a P-47 lumbers uphill. A German Bf-109 could climb to combat altitude in minutes. A P-47 took longer. And in air combat, altitude was life. Whoever was higher won. American pilots began to worry. They were flying an aircraft that the enemy could easily overfly. They wrote home, complaining that they were being forced to fly a brick. They envied the nimble British Spitfires. They believed the P-47 was a costly mistake by the Pentagon, that it would be an armored flying coffin. But they, and those arrogant German pilots, were ignorant of this. That Alexander Kartveli didn't design the P-47 to dance with the enemy. He designed it to crush them. And the secret to the flying brick's power was about to be unlocked by a simple law of physics: gravity. The pilots of the 56 Fighter Group soon discovered that while the Thunderbolt couldn't climb with a German Messerschmitt, and it certainly couldn't turn with a Japanese Zero, it could do one thing better than any other machine in the sky. It could fall. It was a simple matter of physics. When you point a 7-ton object at the ground and apply 2,000 horsepower, gravity ceases to be a burden and becomes a weapon. The P-47 didn't just dive. It plummeted like a lead weight dropped from a skyscraper. German pilots, accustomed to the lighter Spitfires and Mustangs, made a fatal miscalculation. When they saw a P-47 on their tail, they did what they always did. They pushed the stick forward and entered a steep dive, confident their sleek, lightweight fighters could outrun the clumsy American tub. They were wrong. In a dive, the Thunderbolt was terrifyingly fast. It could break the sound barrier before the term breaking the sound barrier was even widely understood. While the lighter German planes started to shudder and shake as they approached terminal velocity, their controls locking up due to air compression, the heavy P-47 just kept accelerating. It tore through the sky like a freight train. The Thunderbolt pilot would watch the German plane grow larger in his gun sight, helpless, shaking violently as it tried to escape the laws of momentum. The hunter had become the hunted. The flying brick was catching the eagle. This discovery changed American tactics overnight. They stopped trying to dogfight, stopped trying to dance, stopped trying to turn. Instead, they adopted energy fighting. They utilized the boom and zoom. The tactic was brutal and simple. Climb high, loiter above the enemy formation, and wait. When the moment was right, the P-47 seconds would roll over and drop on the enemy like hammers from heaven. They would scream down, slash through the German formation with blinding speed, destroy their targets, and then use that massive kinetic energy to zoom back up into the safety of the altitude, leaving chaos in their wake. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't chivalrous, it was industrial slaughter. And when they dove, they brought with them the most destructive armament ever mounted on a single-engine fighter. If the engine was the heart of the Thunderbolt, the guns were its teeth. Alexander Kartveli hadn't just built a plane around an engine. He had built a flying gun platform. While the British Spitfire typically carried a mix of smaller machine guns and perhaps 2 cannons with limited ammunition, and the German Bf-109 relied on a single nose-mounted cannon, the P-47 relied on pure, overwhelming volume. 8 Browning M2, 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. The 50 caliber round is a horrific projectile. It doesn't just poke holes in sheet metal, it tears it apart. It carries enough kinetic energy to shatter engine blocks, sever hydraulic lines, and rip wings off their spars. Now, multiply that by 8. When a P-47 pilot squeezed the trigger, he wasn't firing a gun, he was unleashing a natural disaster. The 8 guns combined fired over 100 rounds per second. That is 6,000 rounds per minute. Pilots described the experience of firing the guns as slowing the plane down in midair. The recoil was so powerful it felt like hitting a wall. For the German pilot on the receiving end, the effect was instant and catastrophic. There was no damage. There was only disintegration. American ground crews would set the guns to converge at a specific distance, usually 300 yards. This was the kill zone. If a German fighter was caught in that convergence point, 8 streams of armor-piercing incendiary bullets would meet in a space the size of a basketball. Footage from gun cameras of the era tells the story better than words ever could. You don't see pieces flying off the enemy aircraft. You see the enemy aircraft simply cease to exist as a flying machine. Wings sheared off. Fuselages snapped in half. Fuel tanks exploding in a ball of flame that the P-47 would fly right through, emerging from the smoke covered in soot but ready to kill again. The Jug was no longer a joke. It was the Juggernaut. But inflicting damage was only half the equation. To win the war of attrition over Europe, the plane had to survive. And this is where the legend of the P-47 truly was cemented. It wasn't just about how hard it could hit. It was about how hard it could get hit. By 1944, stories began to circulate in the mess halls of airbases across England. Stories that sounded impossible. Stories of planes coming back with half a wing missing. Planes coming back with cylinders blown off the engine. Planes coming back looking like Swiss cheese. The P-47 was built tough. It had a self-sealing fuel tank, a concept that saved countless lives. If a German bullet pierced the tank, the rubber lining would expand and seal the hole, preventing the fuel from leaking and catching fire. The cockpit was a bathtub of armor plating. The pilot sat in a bucket seat made of steel, protecting him from ground fire below and enemy fighters behind. The windshield was bulletproof glass so thick you could hit it with a sledgehammer and leave only a scratch. But the biggest survival advantage was the engine itself. Remember the R-2800 Double Wasp? It was an air-cooled radial engine. The Spitfire and the P-51 Mustang used liquid-cooled inline engines. A liquid-cooled engine is like a racehorse, high performance but fragile. If a single stray bullet nicked the radiator or a coolant line, the coolant would leak out, the engine would seize up within minutes, and the pilot would be going down. The P-47 didn't have a radiator. It didn't have coolant. It was cooled by the wind rushing over its cylinders. You could shoot a cylinder completely off a P-47 engine, and it would cough, sputter, shake violently, but it would keep running. You could put a hole through an oil line, and the engine would grind itself to pieces for 20 minutes, just enough time to get the pilot back over the English Channel. It was this ruggedness that gave American pilots a psychological edge. They knew that even if they made a mistake, even if they got jumped, their machine would forgive them. It would take a beating that would disintegrate a Spitfire, and it would bring them home. No story illustrates this unkillable nature better than the legendary encounter of Robert S. Johnson. It was the 26th of June 1943. Johnson was flying his P-47, named Half Pint, back from a mission. He had been shot up badly. His hydraulic system was destroyed. His canopy was jammed shut, trapping him inside the cockpit. He was a sitting duck, limping home at low speed. That was when he was spotted by Egon Meyer, one of Germany's top aces. Meyer was flying a Focke-Wulf 190, and he saw an easy kill. He maneuvered behind the crippled American plane and opened fire. Meyer fired 20mm cannon shells into the P-47 seconds fuselage. He blew apart the rudder. He shredded the elevator. He put huge holes in the wings. Johnson huddled inside his armored cockpit, listening to the explosions ripping his plane apart, waiting to die. But the plane didn't explode. It didn't spin. It just kept flying. Meyer was confused. He circled around and attacked again. He fired his machine guns into the engine cowling. He raked the cockpit glass. The P-47 kept flying. Meyer ran out of ammunition. He had poured his entire payload into this single American fighter. He pulled his Focke-Wulf up alongside Johnson's P-47. He looked into the cockpit. He saw Johnson looking back at him. The German ace shook his head in disbelief. He had never seen a machine absorb that much punishment. Out of respect, or perhaps simple awe, Meyer rocked his wings in a salute and peeled away, leaving Johnson to limp back to England. When Johnson landed, the ground crew stopped counting the bullet holes after they reached 200. There were 21 20mm cannon shell impacts. 5 of them would have been enough to down a bomber. The P-47 had taken 21, and lived. By 1944, the war in the air was changing. A new player had arrived on the stage, the P-51 Mustang. The Mustang was everything the Thunderbolt was not. It was sleek, aerodynamic, and had the incredible range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. It was the sports car the generals had always wanted. Many thought this was the end of the road for the flying brick. If the Mustang could handle the dogfights and the escort missions, what use was a 7-ton monster that drank fuel like a battleship? But the P-47 didn't retire. It simply changed jobs. It looked down from 30,000 feet, saw the German tanks, trains, and supply trucks moving across France, and decided to go to work. The Thunderbolt became the Jabo. Jabo was short for Jagbomber, the German word for fighter bomber. It was a word whispered with terror by every German soldier on the Western Front. While the P-51 Mustang was a thoroughbred racehorse, it had a glass jaw. Its liquid-cooled engine couldn't handle ground fire. One lucky shot from a German rifleman could pierce the radiator, and the Mustang would come down. The P-47, with its air-cooled radial engine, didn't care about rifles. It didn't care about machine guns. It barely cared about light flak. It could fly right down the throat of the German army, absorb the punishment, and deliver a payload that rivaled a dedicated bomber. U.S. Army engineers started strapping everything they could find onto the P-47 Second's wings. They hung 500-pound bombs. They hung 1,000-pound bombs. They attached triple-tube rocket launchers. A fully loaded P-47 inches late 1,944 carried a bomb load heavier than a B-17 Flying Fortress carried on long-range missions earlier in the war. Think about that. A single-seat fighter carrying a strategic bomber's payload. The results were apocalyptic. P-47 squadrons roamed the French countryside like packs of wolves. They hunted trains. They hunted convoys. They hunted Tiger tanks. There is a famous account of a German panzer column trying to move to the front during the Battle of the Bulge. They heard a low rumble in the sky. Then came the scream, the distinctive, terrifying whistle of the P-47 diving. The lead tank exploded. Then the rear tank exploded. The column was trapped. For the next 20 minutes, the P-47 Seconds systematically dismantled the elite German armor division with rockets and .50 caliber fire. The 12.7 mm armor-piercing rounds from the P-47 Seconds' 8 guns could punch through the top deck armor of almost any German vehicle. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was wounded not by a tank, not by infantry, but by a strafing attack from a P-47 Spitfire patrol. Historical accounts vary on the exact plane, but the terror was the same. By the end of the war, the flying brick had racked up a scorecard that is almost unbelievable. P-47 Seconds claimed the destruction of 9,000 locomotives, train engines, 86,000 railroad cars, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles and tanks, 68,000 trucks. It essentially paralyzed the German logistics network. It stopped the Wehrmacht from moving. And it did all this while still shooting down over 3,700 enemy aircraft in the air. History often remembers the pretty ones. We remember the Spitfire for its elegant elliptical wings. We remember the Mustang for its silver shine and its role in saving the bombers. The P-47 Thunderbolt doesn't get the same glory. It sits in museums like a brooding giant, overshadowed by its sleeker cousins. But ask the men who fought. Ask the bomber crews who looked out their windows and saw that massive, comforting shape flying alongside them. Ask the infantrymen on the ground in Bastogne who cheered as the Thunderbolts cleared the path for them. And most importantly, ask the pilots. There was a saying among American fighter pilots in Europe: if you want to take a picture to send to your girlfriend, stand next to a P-51. But if you want to survive the war and go home to see her, climb inside a P-47. Alexander Kartveli didn't build a beautiful plane. He built a survivor. He proved that in the brutal mathematics of war, 2,000 horsepower, 8 machine guns, and 7 tons of steel beats aerodynamic elegance every single time. The P-47 wasn't just a plane. It was a flying tank. It was a battering ram. It was the ultimate battlefield hacker that broke every rule of aviation design and won the war because of it. So the next time you see a picture of this ugly, fat, magnificent beast, don't laugh. Just remember, that brick saved the world. What do you think? In a dogfight for your life, would you choose the speed of the Mustang or the armor of the Thunderbolt? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you enjoyed this story of the flying brick, you have to watch this video right here. It's the story of the junkyard gun, another ugly weapon that everyone laughed at until it destroyed an entire army. Click right here, and I'll see you in the next one.